request? And the request also?
Sorry?
And the request?
Oh, yes. Ray, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
He's on mute.
Oh,
okay.
Hang on. I'm muted.
So Dr. Deonandan is one of my profs from the University of Ottawa. He's an epidemiologist and associate professor with the School of Health Sciences at U Ottawa. So he has been posting a lot and doing a lot of media about COVID-19. So I asked him to come onto our call today to give his perspective as an epidemiologist. Some of you guys forwarded me your questions for him, so I've sent them along to him, and hopefully he can shed some light on those questions that you had. So I'll pass it over to him.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just before we do that, if I can just interrupt, the doctor has requested if he could tape the beginning part of our call for just a tape that he's presented this to us. I'm okay with it. Does anyone have any objections? Okay, silence is golden.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you.
That was going to be my opening question, so fantastic. Hopefully you can all see me. My camera points upwards, unfortunately, so you're going to see the inside of my nostrils a lot. That's something we're going to have to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I've put together some slides. I'm going to share them with you right now. Let me see if I can get... come on. We don't want this. I want these. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Are you able to see this presentation?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay. So let's begin. What I'm going to do is go through the modeling, just a review of some of the modeling that's been done by various countries and make it specific to Ontario as well. And I'll talk about some of the timelines people are talking about, and I'll go through the questions that were sent to me. All right. So first, some words on modeling. If you don't know how modeling is done mathematically, it's as much an art as it is a science. The science part is the math, obviously. The art part is figuring out which variables to throw in and how specific you want to be. Because when building any kind of mathematical model, you can fit the present really, really well. I can describe what's going on right now really well if I throw all the variables at it. But the more I try to describe the present, the less able I am to describe the future. That's why it's one of the reasons so many models are a bit different. It's the art of which variables to keep, which assumptions to keep. Okay, so I don't know which assumptions were used to build the Ontario model that was presented on Friday. They're a bit secretive about that, but I can make some guesses. And keep in mind that all models are imprecise by nature, and the further out in time we project, the dramatically more imprecise they become. That's why the best ones have error bars that are quite huge. If you recall, in Ontario they projected over 2 years 3,000 to 10,000 deaths, or 15,000 deaths. That's a huge range. That's because the further we go, the wider that range becomes. I should also point out that all models should be updated regularly. So watch your news. As more information comes down the pipeline, hopefully public health will be updating their guesses. Now, most of the models made for COVID so far, the projection models, compare 3 scenarios. The laissez-faire model, which is what would have happened had we done nothing, and pretty much no one is doing nothing, except maybe Sweden a little bit. The second scenario is the social distancing scenario, which is, you know what that is, just keeping your distance but carrying on regular life, maybe canceling events of more than 50 people. And the final scenario is the complete lockdown. Sometimes we call the social distancing scenario the mitigation model. That's we just try to keep the number of cases at a manageable amount, but keep on having them flow through the system. The purpose of that is to get all the population infected at some point, or 70% infected at some point, but not at a rate that will overwhelm the system. That way we achieve herd immunity. That's what Sweden's going for. That's what the UK was going for. And then the third scenario, lockdown, That's what we're closer to now as a result of recent policy changes. In Ontario and in many states in the US, everyone's staying at home. So the idea there isn't mitigation, it's suppression. We get the number of cases down to a bare minimum as quickly as we can. Okay, so keep that in mind. Last thing I'm going to say is I'm going to answer as many questions as I can, but there are going to be a lot of questions I can't answer. I'm a clinician. I'm not a clinician, rather. I'm a scientist. So I will shy away from the clinical questions, but I'll try my best. So you probably remember this slide from the presentation given by Ontario Public Health. And essentially, it is showing the expected rate of change for ICU occupation in Ontario. It's important we keep the measurement in mind. This is ICU occupation. It's not hospitalization. It's not deaths. It's not cases. And the outcome matters. The assumption is that as time goes on, those three measures will be highly correlated. The more ICU occupation, the more hospitalization, the more incident cases, and the more death. But if you recall, they projected that by this week, we should be exceeding the current available capacity of ICU beds in Ontario. That's why the surge is on to build more capacity so that we won't exceed that. The peak should come, according to this model, by the mid of April, and then decline after that. Keep in mind that the decline in cases after the peak will be much slower than the acceleration. So it took us 2, 3, 4 weeks to get to the peak. It's going to take us longer to decline. Okay. So that's not the only model possible. Again, I don't know what assumptions they made. I'm guessing it was a basic econometric model. I can throw some words around that don't mean anything to you. But there are other models. For example, David Fissman, who is an elite modeler in Toronto, has something he calls the IDEA model. And I always forget what IDEA stands for. It's some exponentiation and decay, something like that. But his model incorporates the application of the public health intervention, meaning that we can see that this is the rising case, and then after we started social distancing, the flattening began. So this is his model for BC, and it seems to be tracking exactly how he predicts it. In BC, the cases were multiplying, and then they're flattening out. So BC seems to have things under control. Knock on wood. Fissman has not released a similar model for Ontario, mostly because he feels Ontario data is not clean, and it isn't. We can talk about the data pipe if you want. That's academic stuff. So I want to show you what a clean model looks like. This is Iceland. Iceland is very transparent in their projections, and Iceland has a different way of collecting information. Whereas we and the Americans only know the cases that we test, and those are going to be the symptomatic serious cases that come to hospital, right? So based upon testing only serious cases, we have a sense of the trajectory that we're on. Iceland does random testing in addition to testing symptomatic cases. So that gives them a better sense of the true prevalence of the disease in their community. And they have built this model here. The dots represent the actual observations, and the line represents what they think is going to happen. The dotted line represents the worst case scenario. So far, they're seeing the cases track as predicted according to their model. So that's inspiring. And they, like us, project a peak in mid to late April. So the model that I'm very bullish on, that the Americans make their projections on, is from the IHME. That's the Institute of Health Measurement and Evaluation. And they're backed by the Gates Foundation, so they've got some credibility. And I've got a couple of quotes from them so you understand where they're coming from. Our model says that social distancing will likely lead to the end of the first wave of the epidemic by early June. The question of whether there will be a second wave, possibly a third, will depend on what we do to avoid bringing it back. Okay, so the wave will descend throughout May, if all goes well, disappear by the end of June, and we can hopefully have some semblance of normalcy. We'll talk about what that looks like over the summer, assuming we make the right choices but brace ourselves for a return of a smaller wave in September and possibly a third wave later on. So, by the end of the first wave, an estimated 97% of the population of the USA, and likely Canada, will still be susceptible to the disease, meaning we will not have herd immunity. So we need to have these public health investments like testing and screening. Okay, so this is their model for the USA. You will note this is resource count. So in this case, it's hospital beds needed. They're projecting they're going to need most of their hospital beds in mid-April, like everybody else. So everyone's kind of finding the same trend line. The shaded area is the error. I mentioned that the further in time we go, the more error we have. So it can be as bad as 200 or 300,000 beds that they need. The Americans have 1 million beds. Any given time, maybe 75% are occupied. So they have 250,000 beds free. They're going to hit possibly bed saturation in mid-April. This is their projected ventilator need. Again, same time frame, but they're going to need 25,000 to 45,000 ventilators in a couple of weeks. And lastly, their projected deaths. So they're projecting that they're going to have 3,000 deaths per day in a couple of weeks. That's the likely scenario. And the good scenario is about 1,500 deaths per day in a couple of weeks. We model deaths because deaths are a cleaner kind of data. Ideally, we would be modeling cases, but cases are subject to testing bias, and I can talk about that if you like. Okay, so everyone wants to know, when will this all end? Nobody knows, but there are some scenarios. So here are 4 possible scenarios. First scenario is this is all over in 1 or 2 months. This is highly unlikely because it means we got most of this wrong, that this thing is not as dangerous, not as infectious, not as intractable as we thought. It's unlikely. 3 to 4 months, this could be mostly over. This is possible. I think this is quite possible if we get our public health infrastructure in order. And this requires vision and leadership, and I think we can do it. It could be over in 4 months to a year. That assumes we'll have a normalish kind of summer, with no sporting events and no large groups, but we expect a second wave in the fall because we did not prevent it with public health measures. And the last case is this is over in 2 years because we didn't do our public health job and we didn't learn anything about how to treat this disease. Okay, so let's go through the questions that were sent to me, and hopefully this will be comprehensive. The first question is on Friday, meaning the Ontario Public Health presentation. They spoke about the pandemic lasting as long as 2 years. How do they know this? Well, 2 years is based on the current spread of the disease, both globally and locally, and the assumption that the disease will stop when herd immunity is achieved. And we think herd immunity for this disease will be achieved when 60 to 70% of a given population has it. Now, at the global level, that might take a couple of years. If we quarantine the entire country and just close the borders and stuff like that, we can maybe move that timetable up and infect everyone quickly, if that's what we want. So on the outside chance that we can't get things in order, it will peter out on its own in 2 years just by the nature of herd immunity itself, assuming immunity is possible. And that's a question that's followed up later. Keep in mind, 2 years is also the timeline for the arrival of a vaccine, because the world record of vaccine invention to deployment is 18 months. So that's the basement that we're working on here. Currently, there are efforts to pull out all the regulatory plugs to see if we can accelerate this, but there are certain hardwired time limitations that we cannot get past, like testing, making sure that an entire disease cycle is realized for a vaccine. So I can't imagine having a vaccine before 10 months, but who knows? A Manhattan Project-like approach may get us there faster. But 2 years is the likely timeline. Can you explain why, if most of us have been on 14-day isolation, wouldn't that mean fewer cases are coming out now? Okay, that's a good question. The problem is that while most people are isolated, many are not. This is why social distancing is not as powerful as complete quarantine for rapidly bringing about that peak. So the people who remain in the community are spreading at a certain rate. And based upon that rate, then we project forward and see the peak coming when we do. So always keep in mind that incident data and death data are lagging indicators. They represent things that happened 2, 3, even 4 weeks ago, depending upon the experiencers of the disease and the disease timeline. The incubation period, the median, is about 5 days. The symptomatic time frame is anywhere from 5 to 30 days. Hospitalization is anywhere from 2 to 30 days. So all that in mind, that's why the peak is pushed a little bit in front, even though most people are doing the right thing and avoiding infection. So this is the fuzziness of mathematics. It's not going to be completely right, but all the models seem to point to 2-3 weeks from now. Keep in mind the peak would have been much sooner and probably smaller had we had these extreme isolation protocols put into place earlier and with more rigidity. But that's a governmental decision where you have to decide what's best for the community, the economy, or keeping a plug or a lid on this outbreak. Okay, what factors do they look at to predict when a surge will hit? The most important factor is the rate of production of new cases. This is the R naught. You probably heard of the reproduction number. That's the number of people that a given infection can produce. So globally, or rather in China, the R naught was about 2.3 or 2.5. But with social distancing and quarantine, that gets extended. That becomes like lesser and lesser and lesser. The idea is to get it to 1, which means no growth at all, and less than 1, which is negative growth, so diminishment. Keep in mind that most good models focus on deaths rather than incidents, because deaths are a cleaner estimate. We don't know what the actual prevalence rate and or incidence rate is in our population because we are not doing random testing. In fact, Ontario is probably one of the worst provinces for proportional testing in Canada. And that's reflected in our inability to really get a grasp of what's handling. So we focus on deaths instead, which aren't perfect because, it's entirely possible that the disease is expanding rapidly in the non-hospitalizable demographic. But we're only seeing the hospitalizable demographic, i.e. old people. And that's giving us a false impression of the spread of a disease. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And looking at deaths, if institutions increasingly focus on palliation in-house, those deaths will not be captured in the data registry, not for some time. So this will give us a skewed impression, an underestimation of the actual death rate as well. In Italy, many healthcare providers have been infected even though some had full PPE. Are there concerns that this could be airborne? Yes, absolutely. In fact, most scientists now believe that a proportion of transmission is due to aerosol transmission. So if you don't know, there are many methods of transmitting an infection. Number 1 is physical contact, like sexual contact or that sort of thing. There's no evidence that this disease is transmitted that way. Number 2 is droplet transmission. That's when your respiratory system is infected and you cough something up, it comes out of your lungs or your nose, and it lands on someone else's face or eyeball and they get it. That's probably how this is being transmitted. Number 3 is vector transmission. That's when a mosquito would bite you, then bite somebody else. There is no evidence that this can be transmitted by a vector. Number 5 is surface transmission, or fomite. That's when a droplet lands on a surface, like a doorknob, and stands there for a while, and then someone else touches that doorknob and then touches their face sometime later and gets infected. That is enormously plausible in this scenario. I don't know of any evidence to say that anyone has been infected that way through fomite transmission, but it is experimentally quite plausible. Therefore, we treat it as being likely. And the last is aerosol. So aerosols are the nuclei of the droplets that you exhale that are quite small. So the droplets obviously are bits of virus surrounded by fluids. So if you take away the fluids, the virus component is quite small, and it could alight on particles in the air, like the dust particles you see in your house right now, and they could linger in the air for a much longer period of time. That is enormously plausible and highly likely. So it's a bit controversial. The science does show that a proportion of transmission is probably aerosol-based. The lion's share is definitely droplet-based. What does this mean for healthcare providers? It means that the PPE probably, in my opinion, must be modified to deal with aerosol transmission and or have good ventilation in the places of care. This is a controversial statement, and I'm sure it may elicit some conversation, but there I said it. Okay, the new data is showing a subset of the population may be showing GI symptoms and not what respiratory. Is there more evidence of this, and how is it being tested? Yeah, there's some pretty strong evidence. And if you think about the science, the virus binds to the ACE2 receptor, which is located in smooth muscle that we often find in lung tissue. It's also found in the intestines. So it's entirely possible, and in fact it's been demonstrated, that the virus can infect gastrointestinal tissue. Therefore, they have found it many times in the feces of patients. So, and as you're well aware, that many patients now present with GI symptoms. There's one study that I linked to over here that showed that 62% of their patients presented with GI symptoms, and 19% of those, of all the patients, presented only with GI symptoms at first. So unfortunately, the online testing tools, the assessment tools, like if you go on your state or province's website and do the online assessment tool that asks you things like, do you have a fever? Do you have a cough? Have you traveled lately? Those are great. As yet, I've not seen one that incorporates, do you have diarrhea or nausea or any other gastrointestinal symptoms? Probably should, in my opinion. So right now, testing is done the same as with the respiratory symptoms, with the nasal swab. The nasal swab has its own issues that we can talk about, including a very high false negative rate. But there is no specific GI test that I'm aware of. You can test feces after the fact, but I don't see the point of that when there is a swab test available. Tests in China have shown the virus may stay on for more than 30 days based on evidence of testing human feces. Okay, I'm not aware of any evidence beyond this, but yeah. There is a lot of evidence that the length of hospitalization varies a lot, from anywhere from 5 days, 2 days to 2 weeks to a month or longer, and that suggests that some patients remain infectious for longer. So when we're doing these models, we're using the median estimate of infectivity, which doesn't incorporate everybody's level of infectivity. So some patients are going to be quite different, and that's going to depend upon their level of immune response and the extent of viral shedding that is maintained in their bodies. In terms of surfaces that the virus can alight upon, again, there's been no in vivo testing of this, but a lot of experimental testing in the laboratory conditions that show that the virus can remain viable on a variety of surfaces from anywhere from 3 hours to several days. In general, the harder the surface, the longer it stays viable. The softer the surface, the less long it stays alive. So steel is what it likes the best. It can live on steel a very long time. It doesn't like copper much. Copper has strange antimicrobial properties that seems to kill or disable a lot of microbes and viruses. Cardboard, maybe a day if it's lucky. Fabrics, a few hours. So you may want to keep that in mind when you think about disinfecting surfaces in your facilities. It would be great if I could discuss any earlier findings, whether someone who has recovered from COVID-19 could catch it again. I love this question, and because it's a great epidemiology question. So far, I've only seen one reported case of someone supposedly being reinfected, and that was a woman in her 40s in Japan. And she recovered and tested positive again. Now, most jurisdictions, when testing recovery, define a recovery as a negative swab, 2 negative swabs within a 24 or 48-hour period. I don't know if that was the definition for this woman. The Germans now use a recovery definition of, I think, 10 days of no symptoms after having had symptoms. And I think Quebec is using that definition now too, and so is BC. And the reason for that is twofold. One, you save on tests. And two, the test is not good. So the current swab tests have a horrible sensitivity with false negative rates of up to 30%. That's insane. So I highly suspect, in fact, I would put money on it, that this woman in Japan, her initial recovery was due to a false negative test. She was not recovered. The test lied. So there's a lot of experimental evidence to suggest that being reinfected is not possible when true recovery has happened. So I've linked here to a preprint study. Preprint means it hasn't gone through peer review yet. They said monkeys who are susceptible to this virus, when exposed to the virus, developed antibodies and so became resistant. And then the scientists found that it was difficult or impossible to reinfect them afterwards. That's good news. There is some controversy about whether infection with this virus would confer immunity once you recover. So far, all signs point to yes. You do become immune once you've recovered, at least for a while. So the common cold, for example, once you get the common cold, you can get it again, but you got a couple of months probably of immunity until another version of the virus gets you. With SARS-1, we think it gave you immunity for 1 or 2 years. The same with MERS, the Middle Eastern coronavirus. So there's no reason to think that this virus will be any different. The only way it would not be that way if it was mutating very, very fast. You probably read in the papers about there being 8 strains of the virus circulating around the world right now. That's probably true. Viruses do mutate a lot, but the mutations are not serious mutations. I think of them as different races of the same species. The same thing is going to kill them all, meaning the same antibodies will recognize it. It's when it mutates into something so different that our antibodies don't recognize it that it becomes a problem. And so far, that's not happening, as far as most science says. Can I discuss any trends in the Ontario numbers? Well, the problem is that Ontario didn't present a lot of nuance. All I can say is the cases and presumably the deaths, because they're probably correlated, are expected to peak in the coming weeks and dwindle to the end of May. And that's assuming that the social distancing and our isolation protocols remain in place. If there's any deviation from that process, then the curve gets extended further and we'll have to stay in longer. That's why it's important for everyone to take this seriously and to stop being asymptomatic transmitters. Okay, what do we need to know? We need to know the true prevalence of the disease. That's why we have to deploy some random testing at some point. If we know the true prevalence, we'll know how close we are to herd immunity, and that'll tell us how much longer we have to deal with this. It'll also tell us where in the population most of the cases are, so we can focus our public health investments there and maybe relax our restrictions on other parts of the country. The true CFR. CFR is a case fatality rate. That's the proportion of cases who die. The true CFR and hospitalization rate for given demographic groups need to be known. Why? Because we need to know how serious it really is. We know for the elderly it's serious. We don't really know how serious it is for the obese or the diabetics or the hypertensives or the asthmatics. These things need to be figured out. And relatedly, we need to know which risk factors lead to hospitalization, disability, and death. So is it asthma? Is it cancer? Is it, again, obesity? What is it? Is it race? It could be something as duplicitous as that. The serology test is going to be a game changer, and I encourage you all to be on the lookout when this arrives. A serology test tests for the presence of an antibody that your body has made. It means that you have been exposed to the virus and have mounted an immune response. If you are healthy today and test positive for a good serology test, it means that you were infected in the past and you recovered, and now you're probably immune. But the serology tests that are currently on the market are a bit problematic, which is why none of them have been licensed in Canada yet. Some are available in the US in different states. The British have one that they're trialing, but it's problematic. We don't know, for example, how much of the antibody is needed to confer immunity. So if the test says you test positive for the antibody, does it mean you're immune? How much do you actually need to get? We don't know if the antibodies that it finds are for this coronavirus, or maybe it's for other coronaviruses like the common cold. We don't want you thinking that because you have the common cold, you're now immune to COVID-19. So that's a case of false positives. And if this actually works, though, then this is great, because then we can figure out how far along to herd immunity we really are, and we can start issuing immunity passes to people to go work with vulnerable populations to move about freely. So that would be a game changer, and stay tuned because it's coming in a couple of weeks. Everyone's got a full court press on to provide a serology test for mass deployment. Other things that might be important. So you may have heard some whisperings about the BCG vaccine. That's the tuberculosis vaccine that's been around for decades. And there are some ecological studies. Ecological studies compare different countries. Ecological studies that show that countries where the BCG vaccine is mandatory for everybody seem to have lesser serious issues with COVID-19. And the reason for that is the BCG vaccine seems to give an overall general immune response in your body that protects you from a variety of things, including some cancers. So it's being trialed right now in the Netherlands and in Australia with healthcare workers. And if the outcome is good, I expect, again, another full court press on to produce as much BCG vaccine as we can, especially for frontline workers. There are a lot of emerging treatments. You know about chloroquine. Zinc is being used liberally in hospitals in North America. Ivermectin is showing some promise. Interferon is being used by the Cubans. A lot of things are being trialed, even vitamin C. Megadosing vitamin C is undergoing 3 clinical trials in China, and it's being used in at least one hospital in New York. So I'm confident, I'm bullish on these new treatments reducing the death rate and suffering rate in our hospitals. And of course, plasmapheresis is available now. Plasmapheresis is when you get plasma from recovered patients and you just spin down the antibodies and give them to a struggling patient, a kind of borrowed immunity. There's some dangers there, of course, because you could be initiating a different kind of immune response, which does not lead to good things. So this would be on a serious case-by-case basis only. But all these developments lead me to believe that our case fatality rates are going to drop a lot in the coming future, in the coming weeks and months. Okay, that's the part of serious part of my presentation. That's my website there if you want to visit it. I do blog about this regularly, and I encourage you to visit the website. I'm going to stop sharing now to show you my pretty face, and I can answer more questions if you have them. So, are there any additional questions? I'll check the chat to see if anything has been asked. What is the comparison between COVID deaths and influenza? Okay, would COVID continue to be a chronic disease like the flu? That's a good question. So, the comparison of COVID deaths and influenza right now is that influenza still kills more people, but we're early in the COVID experience. And COVID is going to kill more people in a very short amount of time. As I keep saying, this is not a health crisis, it's a health systems crisis. And the difference is a health crisis is all about salvation from a vaccine or a cure. A health systems crisis is all about maintaining the health of your health system, and the salvation comes from administration and management. So would COVID continue to be a chronic disease? Yeah, that's the expectation. That in 2, 3, 4 years, it will be something that comes about seasonally, and it'll just be a formulation we'll probably have to add to our yearly vaccines. By then, there'll be sufficient herd immunity in the population that it won't be as serious, and by then, I expect it to have mutated towards non-lethality. But SARS went away, right? SARS-1. And SARS-1 went away, we think, because it also mutated towards non-lethality. We also think the Spanish flu probably mutated its way into nothingness. So these viruses tend to do that. It's an evolutionary path. It doesn't make sense to kill your host. So over enough time, that's the direction they eventually go, if enough people get infected. So yes, two-part question from Chris Allen. What's your question, Chris? Chris Aiken, rather.
I'm gonna unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So first off, the week of February 21st, I was the sickest I've ever been in my life with exact COVID symptoms. Is it possible someone in Toronto could have caught it at that early point in time?
Absolutely, it's possible. So the
Really?
first cases in North America were in late to mid January, and there's no reason to think it couldn't have arrived earlier. I mean, we had flights from China coming in well before then. So,
Okay.
in my opinion, it
Mhm.
probably has been here a little longer, but not that potently. It's a controversial opinion, but that's what I hold. The serology test will tell us this. So there have been several cases of people having all the symptoms, brutal flu-like symptoms, loss of smell, all the stuff you read about, but then the swab tells them negative. But the swab test is just such a high false negative rate that I don't trust it as much as I used to. So
Interesting.
yeah, so my opinion, which may be contradicted by other people, is that yes, there is a chance it's been here before February.
Okay, so then leads me to the second part of the question. If the 30% false negative isn't the best way to determine if someone doesn't have it, but the 10 days no symptoms could be a better way to look at it.
Yeah.
I had a cough for like a month afterwards. Let's say I was a caregiver, would I had to wait till my cough was completely resolved for 10 days to
It's
go back to
a good
work?
question. I don't know the exact definition of what 10 days without symptoms means. I suspect it probably does mean that. No cough. But again, there are other reasons you could be coughing. It could be, an irritation. It could be allergies.
For sure.
It could be medication. It could even be the common cold. So I presume when we clinically apply that 10-day diagnostic criterion, there are check boxes you go through to rule out other causes. Again, it's a clinical question that I probably shouldn't answer, but epidemiologically, I would think if I were designing that test, I would make that the case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Another question here. Can you talk about the origins of COVID-19? Oh, that's a fun question. So current theory, obviously there are going to be conspiracy theories about bioweapons labs and things like that. Take that for whatever you want. But a coronavirus is not innate to the human experience. There are, I think, 6 species of coronaviruses that we have experience with in the history of the human species. 4 of them are the common cold. One of them is the first SARS one. The second was MERS. And now this new one. So we think it jumped from an animal. That's called a zoonosis when this happens. It jumped from an animal into either us or through another animal. Coronaviruses are very common in bats, and we think that in the wet markets of China, it came off of a bat who then infected a pangolin. The pangolin was probably the amplifier species. It had to mutate to do that. So whenever a virus jumps from one species to another, it means it was able to acquire a piece of DNA, or in this case RNA, from another virus that happened to be around. They just swapped a bit of genetic code, and it was able to jump into the pangolin. And from the pangolin, it was able to jump into humans. Now, when a human infected another human, that represented another mutation. So there's some rapid mutations happening that were a little bit, improbable, but it does happen. That's what happens with influenza regularly. And this virus has a certain characteristic that made it ultra deadly, and that is its infectivity is very, very high. That's because it fits really, really well onto the ACE2 binding site. SARS-1 didn't fit that well. So SARS-1, it didn't infect as easily. But this one, you get a whiff of it and you probably got the disease. So that's where we think the origin is now. And as it's moved across the world, it's mutated again, but it's still pretty much the same thing. Next question. Why do we need to isolate if we have a cough and not the other criteria such as a fever? I don't know if that's true. I don't know. I mean, I assume that the isolation rule is based upon having all the symptoms, the cough plus a fever, but I could be wrong. So I don't think I'm able to answer that question. There may be different rules for healthcare providers. I think they lower the bar for diagnosis for healthcare providers. That's a weak answer. I'm sorry. I haven't got a better one. When do you expect the vaccine will be available? The world record for vaccine preparation is 18 months. This one, they're pulling out all the stops. There's actually a proposal put forth by Harvard to do a challenge trial. A challenge trial is when we obviate the need for a phase 3 clinical trial. We get a bunch of brave volunteers, we violate all the ethics rules, we shoot them up with the vaccine now, and we see in 3 weeks if they're okay. So if the challenge trial goes through, we'll have a vaccine by the end of the year, possibly. But I don't see that happening. I think a better bet is 2 years if we're lucky. Keep in mind, though, there are about, I knew of 3 candidates. It's probably up to 5 or 6 candidates now of vaccines that are moving to human trials. Human trials, though, won't start until the summer at the earliest. That's how slow this stuff happens. Can you speak to the recent tiger-positive COVID? Yeah, that one's confusing. I don't know a lot about it. So if you don't know, in the Bronx Zoo, apparently a tiger got it and may have infected some other cats. I don't know if that's true, first of all. I don't trust these news reports. I'd rather see an actual scientific paper, because a lot of this could be, like the dog that supposedly had it was in fact not infected. They just found viral shedding on the inside of his nose because he smells things. So I don't know how they tested this tiger. Was it a nasal swab? Was it a blood test? I don't know. So I'm skeptical, to be honest. But it has happened before. I mean, it's obviously this thing infects monkeys and apes. We know that. So it's possible, I guess, to infect cats. But we'll see. If it's able to infect other animals, it's probably only able to infect cats, other cats. But that's a virological and zoological question that I probably shouldn't be expressing expertise on. So I guess the way for this virus to go away is to wait for most population to get infected. Yes and no. So there are 2 ways that this ends naturally. One is we get a vaccine and we give everyone herd immunity the artificial way by getting the vaccine. The other is we wait till enough people get it so that we get herd immunity the natural way. And that'll probably take 18 months or so, unless we just drop our guard right now, infect everyone, and accept the deaths, because the deaths will be enormous. It's possible, though, that this thing mutates into irrelevance. It's also possible, and this is controversial, but it's possible that the change in weather will have an effect. So there is some data out of China that suggests that for every rise in temperature and every increase in humidity measure, the virus becomes less transmissible. That's because the droplets don't go as far in humid air and hot air. So it gets harder to transmit it to other people. And some people have observed a corona belt around the world, they call it, where some parts around some latitudes are more likely to get it than others, and that suggests that weather has an effect. So there are other ways it might go away. As well, the treatments coming down the pipeline I find very, very intriguing. And the testing regimens we can deploy can keep this under control such that we don't have to deal with it if we do this right. Let me see. Next question. Do you have an opinion on wearing masks? Yes, I do. I think we should wear masks. And here's why. The arguments against masks are that, well, we're talking here about cloth masks. Obviously, the N95 masks should go to the clinicians, and surgical masks should go to other people who are emergency workers. But make your own cloth mask. And the reason you don't want to do it, first of all, is there's a false sense of security. A mask is a technology, and every technology needs to, how do I put this? Every technology needs to come with it a behavioral component so you know how to use it well. If you're touching your face all the time because there's a mask on it, well, that defeats the purpose. If you're going to the grocery store and getting virus shedding on your mask, and then you go home and you take off your mask willy-nilly and you spread it over your coat and your pants and your shirt, well, that hasn't solved any problems. It's made things worse. So you have to do it right. Because we think that most of the transmission, in fact, 79%, 4 out of 5 cases we think now, are caused by asymptomatic transmission, then having a mask prevents those who have it and don't know they have it from giving it to others. Wearing a mask doesn't prevent you from getting it. My mask protects you, and your mask protects me. But you got to wash that mask every single day. So the the way that I perceive the data suggests that masks are the way to go. And you've probably seen these charts on Facebook, where these ecological charts show the countries that use masks have a much lower transmission rate than countries that don't use masks. So yes, use a mask. Also, cover your eyes. Wear glasses, because the main way of getting it, if you're wearing a mask, is to get it on the incident on your eyeballs, because that's a mucous membrane as well. Did you say that 75% of spread comes from asymptomatic? Yes, that's what I'm saying. There's a study out of China that suggested that during their outbreak, 79%, like close to 80%, 4 out of 5 of infections were caused by asymptomatic carriers. That's a huge number. Can I share data on that? Sure, I'll email it to Celine later on, the study, and she can share it with the rest of you. I mean, it's one study. It may be an overestimate, but let's say it's 45%. That's pretty high. U.S. estimates are half. They're saying that half of transmission is caused by asymptomatic carriers. This is, of course, based on modeling as well. It could be wrong, but if it's 15%, if it's 10%, that's a high number. If we can cut down to asymptomatic transmission, we've got this beat. So I expect with the widespread wearing of masks, we will see dramatic change in transmission rates. There we go. Any more questions? I can talk forever, so. No more questions? Part of what I've been trying to, the message I've been trying to get across to people is that this is not the apocalypse. It's not an extinction level event. For the fatality rate, it's relatively low compared to things like Ebola. So if you get it, and you're probably going to live through it, it's just that this is an assault on the healthcare system. And I know that all of you know this because you all work in the system to some capacity, but it's an important message that needs to be digested all the time so we don't panic, and that we recognize that it's a solvable problem, because healthcare system problems are solvable by healthcare systems managers. Part of that solution is being pursued by your governments in building more capacity, and the more we get tests, the better we be. I mean, the tests that are coming down, we have the on-site rapid tests. Imagine that you go to the dentist or in your long-term care facilities, because that's what you guys are all part of, and before someone comes through the door, they can do an on-site blood test, a finger prick, and in 15 minutes, you know if they have it or not. You can deny them entry or change your policies, whatever. That's the kind of technological innovation that's coming right now that will allow us into a sense of pseudo-normalcy very soon. What kind of cloth mask design do you recommend, and can we boil the mask rather than wash the mask? Boiling the mask. I don't know about boiling the mask. Most people seem to think that cooking kills the virus. So boiling is akin to cooking. If I had to guess, I would say boiling is probably okay, but don't quote me on that. This is something we should check with an infectious disease antimicrobial expert on. Washing with soap and water is the best bet. Some people also recommend spraying the mask on both sides with hydrogen peroxide every day if you have that, in addition to washing. But boiling, that's a good thought. I'm going to check with some people about that. That's good. Okay, I think we're out of time here. Is that right, Celine?
No, Ray, this has been amazing. And Celine, thank you so much for inviting him. So I'll leave it to Celine to close off. But thank you so much. We all appreciate it.
Oh, if I were to post this on YouTube or something, would there be any objections? Nobody else's face is on this and a couple of voices.
I'm good. Any objections? Speak now, forever hold your peace.
If you object, you can email Celine and let me know.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'm going to log out now, and we'll see you guys out and about in the community in a couple of months. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.